interesting, I guess. And so just a quick intro about me. I look back here and there's no slides. It confuses me. So I've been getting paid to write software 20 years, so I guess that's pretty good. I can still get hired, so I like that. So my biggest corporate job, I had 9 years. I was running new product development for a company called Advanced Tactical Systems here in Austin. It's part of a bigger company called Ultra Electronics. It's a $1 billion company based out of the UK. And then the last 3 years, I was doing pure startup space. I had my own startup that didn't work. And then I've been doing MVPs for a bunch of different people. So consulting, helped a lot of different companies. And a lot of the time, what you do is you spend trying to figure out what feature goes in where, because you never have enough money to do all the things you want to do. As Damon mentioned, I'm currently VP of Engineering at Hover Data. And I also sometimes mentor at Founder Institute. So if you're in that incubator, you might see me around there. So just a couple of terms I want to talk about how I use them. I don't know if they're the correct or official way, but this is what I'll talk about. So MVP, minimal viable product. I'm assuming everybody knew that, or you wouldn't have shown up to this talk. It's not about sports. We're not going to talk about Mahomes or anybody. So we're talking that prototype, early stage, whenever your product's about to go live. That's the place I'm talking about. I use the word app. I'm going to use it for web and mobile interchangeably. Technology is making them closer and closer together. I have a couple of caveats where you want to do something slightly different on mobile, like native mobile versus pure web. And then I kind of use all these words the same: feature list, product spec, backlog. They're all just fancy words for your to-do list that you need some sort of priority on. And then finally, I'm going to talk about a couple of products. I don't make any money off these products. They're just ones I happen to use. There might be other ones that are better. So take it for what it's worth. So this is usually how all startups, early stage, this is your life, right? You have a whole bunch of features and your budget's really small or non-existent. And you're like, how do I get all this crap in my suitcase, right? I mean, that's your job. And that's one of the most important jobs as a founder is how to do that. How do you get it all in there? So one of the things you got to think about is, one, that it's not a trip, it's not a one-way trip. Software, you're going to release it more than once unless you do a really bad job the first time. So it's more like you're making a bunch of little trips. And so don't think about those shoes that you really want to take with you, that they're never coming. If they don't make it in that initial release, it just means they're going to come next week or the next week. So it's all about prioritization, bucketing features into making the next release better. And so that's what a lot of the things I'm talking about are things that you can put in that make your life better for the next time. There's a bunch of different stages depending on where you are as a founder. The stuff I'm talking about is at the bottom of that list, right? So this is not idea stage stuff you need to do. This is not when you're talking to users. This is when these are technical things that you're going to use when you go live. And I will also say these things, I've put these into products much later. They're still important, right? You still need them later. So if you're already past the very first release, it's okay. They still will help you. Anybody got any questions real fast? Am I making sense? Can you hear me? Talking too fast? No, they were all shaking their head yes, and then they shook no, so that's good. So my number one thing, the order is also in order of priority, I guess. So this is my number one thing I tell everybody, always add analytics. So analytics are super critical for your app. They're also really easy to put in. If your developer tells you they're hard, they either don't know what they're talking about or they're bullshitting. It's really easy to get analytics, especially on mobile apps. And you want these because as you're a product manager right now, you're also CEO and investor, finder, and all kinds of other stuff, and janitor. But as a product manager, you got to know how your app's being used. You have a ton of opinions. You're like, oh, I think people want to use this. Once it gets released, your opinions don't really matter anymore. Now it's what are people doing with your app? You think this page is awesome in your app, but nobody ever goes there. You don't know that unless you plug analytics in. So analytics tells you where people spend time in your app. It tells you what your most popular content is. It tells you that they like buying apples or whatever they do in your app. You can't find that out unless you stand over their shoulder and watch them, or you plug in some analytics. So analytics gives you dashboard. It shows you summaries, how many users, how many people downloaded it, what iOS version, how big their screen is, all kinds of crazy details. So it's super important. So make sure you plug it in. To plug it in, it's really simple. And I'm just listing like the most popular ones. So if you're building a web application, Google Analytics is the most popular tool to use. It's free. The Firebase Analytics is built also by Google, a company they purchased several years ago. So it's a little bit more mobile-centric, but works very similar to web analytics. And a lot of times you will already have Google Analytics, or you should have your Google Analytics on your marketing website, right? So it's the same tool. You want it plugged in both places, but it'll tell you, like when you're building your product, you use it slightly different because it helps you tell, where you're going to go, and like if there's pages that aren't being used, maybe you should change that. It helps you build up your funnel, so your funnel of where users are coming from. All of that data comes from analytics. So I put the two things at the bottom. You can get a paid version of Google Analytics, but when you're starting out, you don't need it. So almost all these products I talk about, they have a free tier, and it's super simple for the developer to put in. On iOS and Android, you plug in the Firebase SDK and you call analytics.init or something like that. Super simple. You can add a lot more, like you can tag tons of user properties and events, and you could make it expensive, but you don't need to do that at first. So the basic idea is get something in so you can start getting some data. There's no real reason not to do this in your initial release because it's free. So then number 2 on my list, and it's kind of a close second, and I will actually say if you're doing a pure web app, you might want number 2 before 1 because it actually has a lot of the same data, except it will give you more details when something goes wrong. So what I mean by error tracking is figuring out when something goes wrong. And I know you guys are all going to have like perfect code and you won't have any problems when your initial release, but it is very common that things go wrong in the field and you don't know. And what happens is your customer's going to call you, if they care enough to call you, and they're going to say, hey, it doesn't work. And then you're going to turn around and talk to your developer. You're going to tell them, hey, it doesn't work. And they're going to say, it works on my desktop. And so it's like, you're going to end up going back and forth forever. It's really hard to solve the problem of like, it doesn't work in my browser. There's a million browsers. There's a million operating systems. It's a super hard problem to debug without a tool like this error tracking. So you want this so you can know about issues before your customer calls or before your customer deletes your app and says it sucks. You find these problems so you can get them fixed. So there's a bunch of different tools for this also. For web, I like a tool called Sentry.io. There's probably 100 others, or there's at least 10 big ones. Sentry.io has a free tier that's pretty good. So that's always nice because budgets are always small. On mobile, I like Firebase Crashlytics, but there's also other choices. And this is one of the reasons I mentioned you can do this maybe a little later on mobile. The stores, so Android Play and Apple's App Store, they give you some of this capability. So once you release through the store, you will get some crash reports. This data is just a lot more high fidelity, I guess. So it's easier to fix the problems. And then there's a whole bunch of others, like I mentioned, so Rollbar, New Relic, Raygun. Those are all competitors. You should go figure out which one works for you. Again, these are not hard to implement. All of these, well, Sentry.io and Crashlytics at least have a free tier. I think the other guys do as well. For a web app installing, say it's built in React.js or Vue.js, installing this tool is literally like 2 lines of code. So if the developer tells you that's too hard or too expensive, it's not. It's just because they haven't done it before. So that's really the point of this, is to like know about these things to ask for. Because I've done a lot of MVPs and I've never had these on the feature list, and I usually included them because they made my life easier. But if you hire a developer that hasn't done a lot of startup stuff, they won't know. They won't put it in unless you ask. So now we're getting like, this list is, I will say, maybe exponential. Like 1 and 2 are super important. 3 is not as important, but kind of matters. And 4, like, so it goes down in priority. You still want to do it eventually. Maybe you don't have this done before initial release. So automated testing, this ends up being way down most people's lists, because when you're a startup, you're like, is the code even going to survive? I might throw it away, so it doesn't matter. I use this as a check to see if the developer knows what they're doing. Mature development shops will include some sort of testing. It won't be maybe 100% coverage. It might not be super complicated integration testing, but they'll have some set of tests. And you want that because you're paying your IP. If you're building a SaaS product or a mobile app, your company is all based off this source code, and you want to know if it's good and if it works. And the only way to do that is really with tests. So it's kind of a famous quote about, like, if you write code without tests, then it's broken as designed. So that's just a thing to think about and help when you're interviewing developers. Like, ask them, do they write tests? If they don't know what you're talking about, you might want to talk to somebody else. So, but this gets way more complicated in terms of cost and time to install. Like, the tools are all free. Every kind of development from web to mobile, Android and iOS, they all have testing frameworks. So it's all there. It's really just how much development time they're going to spend to build these tests. So that's something you have to decide early on. I just kind of believe that you need some to kind of know what you're doing. I personally write tests as I write code, because if you wait a long time, so if you go to start adding testing in and 3 years in, the developer is going to be like, oh, I'm overwhelmed. It's going to take me 6 months just to add tests. Your customers aren't going to see anything. And then what you find over time is your app has a lot of issues, right? Every time you roll out a new feature, you get 6 new bugs because the system isn't well instrumented from testing. So that's just why you want to do automated testing earlier than later. And then the final piece is similar to the automated testing, but automated deployment. So in the big buzzwords, you always hear about it. There's actually a bunch of companies that have raised a lot of money. They're doing pipelines for continuous integration and continuous deployment. For MVPs, I don't think you actually do continuous deployment. It's not super hard, but it is just money that probably doesn't matter. Your test suite's probably not good enough, so you don't really need continuous deployment. But what you do want is you want to know, like, the 5 magic buttons and steps that your developer did to deploy it. Because if your developer disappears, gets run over by a bus, whatever, you want to know how to get that next version deployed. And so it's amazing to me how many people spend, like, their life savings, they invest all this money in this company, because a lot of times founders are investing their own money, and they have no idea what they paid for. They don't know how to deploy it. If you can't deploy it, it's worthless, right? It's just a bunch of bits. So the deployment, maybe I should have actually defined deployment. Deployment is like, for mobile, it's getting it to the App Store so the App Store can sell it. If it's a web page, it's putting it out on Amazon or Google Cloud or whatever so that you can use it. So it's super important because you want to control your IP. If your IP you paid for, if you can't use it, it's not worth anything. So this automated deployment can be a big task, right? It usually involves a lot of tasking, but at the beginning, start simple. There should be like a script that says deploy or go or whatever, right? There should have something in the source code that lets you know how the developer gets it live. It doesn't really matter how. Like, at first, anything works. There is a whole set of tools called Fastlane for mobile. They're very cool. They do all kinds of awesome stuff. They take some work to set up, though. So you might not do those at first, but they're very, very powerful. And then there's all kinds of tools out there. So almost all of the big code repos, GitHub, GitLab, and Bitbucket all have some sort of automated deployment built in. CircleCI and Travis CI are all companies that's all they do is build automated deployment pipelines. And all those tools, almost all of them have some sort of free tier. And so you can start with nothing. I looked this morning, CircleCI has plans that go up to $250 a month. So we're still not talking about a ton of money. Most of the effort is really in getting the developers to set up. So deployment is harder on mobile. So this is one of the differences. If you're doing web, it's usually very simple. Mobile deployment is harder to automate, so you probably won't do it at first. But a couple things you have to make sure. One, that you own the keys. So you need to be able to log into the iOS store and the Android store so that you have control of that. Because again, if your developer disappears, how do you replace them? It's a super pain. Getting somebody at iOS to believe you that it's really your store when so-and-so set it all up, it's a huge problem. So make sure you own the keys. It's kind of like you had somebody build the house and you just, you're going to move in later, but you can't get into the house. It's like a bad idea. And then at very least, get a screen capture of the process. Have them record their screen on how they upload. So they run Xcode, they push build, they archive it, get all the steps so that even if you don't know what the hell they're talking about, you can go to somebody else and you can give them this video and these keys and they can redeploy it for you. So that's really what's important, is to make it work. Again, for the web, it's easy. It should be like one command. It should be like go. It should not be hard for web applications. If it is, maybe your application's too hard. It depends. I mean, it's possible that it's difficult if you have a super complicated web app. But let's see. So I think the bottom line and sort of the theme through all of these is when you write your user stories, you're really focused on like, oh, I want to find the lost dog or whatever you're doing. You're building something. You really focus on all these features, and you get this huge list of features. And what tends to happen is you forget about the business. You forget about you and like, how am I going to run the business and how am I going to make it better? So I have release 0 today. What am I going to do to get release 1 better, right? So you got to know, do you need to optimize for iOS or Android? Do you have anybody on, which platform is more popular for you? So that's what you want to think about when you add these features into your system, is give them sort of equal weight to all the other user stories. And then finally, I have a totally separate thing, a shameless plug, is that I'm hiring JavaScript developers. If any of you are a JavaScript developer and want a job, come talk to me. Other than that, I think that's really all I have. Anybody got any questions? Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about analytics and North Star metrics, so that do you have any insights on North Star metrics?
So the question was talking about analytics and North Star metrics. So North Star metrics can be like what guides your company, right? I mean, assume that's what you mean by that. So it totally depends on your company, what you're doing. I mean, the job I'm working now, we're enterprise space. So we don't care about users because we don't have very many. It's all about usage. So I think those metrics depend on what you're doing. If you're doing direct consumer, the numbers that I think most often come up are sort of active monthly users. I would even say more than that, which is like in the last 7 days. So what are people, how many people used your app in the last 7 days? And it's really important to know sort of, what do they call it, like cohort of like, hey, people that signed up last week, how many of them are still in the app? And like Firebase does that for you automatically. So they'll give you a graph and it'll show you how many people are still with you. Because I mean, in mobile technology, one of the hardest things is keeping users. So right, I think typical numbers these days is you get somebody to sign up, 30 days later, only 3% of them are still there, right? And it varies a little bit, obviously depends on your app. But real estate on the phone is really hard. They got their set number, whatever, they use Gmail and Chrome and all the things they use all the time. For you to keep being used is rough. And so that ends up being one of the biggest ones of how many people still use it. You can also see how often they use it, but that really depends on your app, right? If it's something they only do once a month, like it's, I don't know, planning dinner or whatever, if it's a daily thing, it really depends on the use case. Does that make sense? All right, anybody got us any questions?
So if nobody else has any other questions, what are some ways to increase that 30-day retention? What are some things that work?
Yeah, so a big one is targeted notifications. So that didn't like make my list. Notifications would probably be maybe 5 of being able to push back, especially on mobile. So notifications can be annoying. It's all the crap that pops up on your phone. Being able to super target those, and you need both. You need analytics in place so you know who you're targeting. So for example, if I was going to do a push notification about this event, I would need to know people in Austin that are developers or startup founders, right? And you need to be able to target those people inside your app. And so you have to have tagged them in some way. So notifications kind of will bring them alive. It's also important in terms of data. If you say you process some data and the result, if you can send that result, it makes your app way more responsive. So it's like automatically there. Yeah.
So you talked a little bit about how would you say these are the parts of the application that we need to build first? It's the foundation, it's the scaffolding that will allow us to build on top of later.
Yeah. So the question was, how do you do feature prioritization, especially if you're a non-technical founder and a developer, right? Is that a good summary? So I'm a big believer. I'll say pragmatic. I'm a believer that you don't need to spend a ton of time writing a lot of foundation code. Use tools that are out there to help you. I call it like the dirt road of like, build something end to end. So make sure it works so I can log in, I can do whatever I do. And there should be one thing. So I believe for a startup to be successful, there has to be like one thing you do better than anybody else. And you don't care about the 50 other things that somebody also does, right? So you have to focus on that one thing. And so then think about everything through that flow. So make it complete, because what you want, like after the first user uses your app, you don't want them to say like, oh, that app has a lot of features and they don't work very well. Like that's not a good response. Well, you really want to say, hey, this app, it's kind of utilitarian, but it is one thing is awesome, right? And they'll remember that one thing. So I think all the focus has to be about that. If the developer's like, oh, we have to do this because when we have like 10,000 users, it's going to be a problem. My answer, and I'm a developer, right, is, well, when we have 10,000 users, we should have enough money to fix that problem, right? And so don't fix tomorrow's problems today, right? I mean, because you can't afford to. So it's like, and so back to the road analogy, like I don't need to build a super highway. There's only like one person a day coming to my app. So you have to be super careful. Don't like pre-building for scale is almost always wrong. And a lot of times you can fix a lot of scale with some money because AWS and Google Cloud and they're good at what they do. So because you typically don't have a scaling problem on the client side, right? It's all on the server side. Yeah, does that help? Sure. Yeah, so it's interesting. So when you talk about, most people talk about like mobile, they have a mobile app. The magic, or the sort of what I call the iceberg, is like you have a mobile app, almost always to do something interesting you have a server, right? And the server you don't see, but it's a lot of times where you spend a lot of money. And so there's actually two pieces of deployment. There's deploying the server code that does all the, maybe it stores, if you're a sports app, it stores the scores and it sends you the stuff back. And the mobile app is just displaying it. So there's basically two sets of problems. So the mobile specific deployment is how you get from let's take iOS for example. How do I get from Xcode to the Apple Store, right? And like I mentioned, that's kind of hard to automate. I mean, it's not super, it is kind of hard because Xcode changes all the time. And it's a bunch of buttons you have to push. You have to sign a key, and you have to upload it to the store, and then you have to wait a couple hours. Anyway, it's a manual process. So that's what I kind of mentioned about the mobile side, like get the screen recording. Now, related to that is the server side. So on the server side, I'm not as familiar with AWS. I think they have something called Code Build. Google Cloud has something called Cloud Build. Those allow you to build you can build whatever you want, I guess, but most of the time they're used for the server code. And so those are tools that help you automatically deploy. But you don't even have to be that complicated. It can literally be like, if you think about your code repo, it's just a bunch of files. There can be a script in there that you grab all your code from. I guess that's another thing. Like all your code should be in a repo. Like your developer shouldn't like hide it. It should be checked into GitHub or Bitbucket, and you should own access to it. It should be your repo, not their repo. But you should be able to pull that down, and there should be some instructions, and there should be like one script that you run. So that's sort of my basic of like, that's how you deploy. Like, I mean, a lot of times in stuff I write, there's a script called deploy.sh, and it's just a simple script, and you run it, and it does whatever it needs to. There's a lot of details to that, but that's sort of what your developer needs to hand that off to you. Like that should be part of what you pay them to do. Is like, I want you to set this up. I want you to teach me how to do it, or teach somebody else to do it. I mean, it needs to be documented. The sort of next step for that is these continuous integration tools, and that's what Circle CI and well, GitLab has it built in. Actually, all of Bitbucket, GitHub, GitLab are all competitors. They all are source repo tools, all good choices to put your code in. They all have things that once you check in code, they can trigger to do a build. That makes sense. So those are all tools to do the deployment. Does that answer your question? Oh. Over here.
Yeah, hi. I'm out of my league here, but it's interesting that you said you could send notifications once they bought the app. Could you just talk a little bit about what you do once and what you do or don't do, like updates or notifications once someone's already got the app in the flow?
Yeah, notifications in the most general sense can be anything. They could be an email or a phone call or an SMS. When I'm speaking, I'm talking specifically about iOS and Android have functionality built in, the little pop-up things that go down. And so both of those platforms have a very sophisticated deployment mechanism to get those notifications to the system. In general, you'll build sort of what I'll call two kinds of notifications. One are automatic. So automatic notifications might be, I don't know, like if you think about not app, like you signed up, you would get maybe an automatic sign, like after you signed up that confirms something. That's like an automatic one. And also maybe you completed whatever, you completed level X. And then, so those are automatic notifications. Those will go to the person that just did that activity. And those are typically written in code. So that's like a feature you would most of the time have to request. Like if you want, say you complete a level in your game and you want a notification to go to them, that's something you have to tell your developer you need because he's going to write that automatically. More generally, once you have notifications enabled for an app, you can send them marketing notifications. And so I most often use Firebase. It has a notifications platform. You can build a audience. And so if you have sort of instrumented your audience correctly, you can go say, I want people that live in Austin and I don't know, they like puppies, whatever. Well, however you've defined, like they've clicked on a button, if you have a button in your app that's called puppies and they've clicked on it 5 times, you would be able to build that audience. So now you select that audience, you type in whatever you want to the notification and you say send. And so that's more of a general marketing notification, but your app has to be instrumented to do all that. So does that kind of make sense? So there's sort of groundwork for you to do those marketing notifications. Yeah.
So for the error tracking, just in the context of the MVP, would you say that Sentry.io or any of the other tools is sufficient, or would you still, complement them with logging, with error tables in the background?
Yeah, so the question was for error tracking in an MVP, was Sentry.io enough, or did you need to complement them with logging and error tables or other things? So ideally, I guess the simple answer is yes. I think Sentry.io is sufficient. What will happen for the user is they're going to get an error. They're not going to see it. Your app probably just breaks, right? So say something's whatever. You're selecting a page and it didn't work. And maybe there's a little spinny thing that doesn't go away because now you're in the web, your JavaScript code's broken. So ideally, when your app gets more robust, it'll handle that error and it'll say a message, say, "Oh, come back later," or whatever it is, right? It'll tell them. So that's sort of like level 2, but that's like an add-on. What Sentry gives you, and any of these other ones will actually now tell you and the developer, hey, on line 52, you screwed up. Like there's something wrong in the code. This is missing, and that's exactly where to go fix it. So error logs and stuff like that on the server side are helpful. But most often, and why I think error tracking is super important for web apps is there's no logging, right? That's really what Sentry's doing is it's logging for you. Because the server is going to say, hey, I handed you all the files and everything's awesome. There's not going to be any errors on the server related to that. That's a client-side error. Does that make sense? So there's sort of a technical separation that's really why you need it. Because on the server side, if everything's done on the server side, it's actually fairly easy to figure out the problem. But it's everything running on the client that you're like, I don't know what happened, it just broke. So. Yeah, so typically what I would do in the past is I would either sit down with whoever was paying me and we would create the accounts at the same time, or they would, if they knew enough, they would create the accounts and add me as a user. So add the developer as a user. So really what you want, so in the Firebase case, so Firebase, there's many different tools underneath Firebase, but you want to be the project owner. Like you, the startup founder, want to have ownership rights of everything. And so, because that developer, you can go and delete them and everything still works. So it means, it means you have to learn some stuff. You're gonna have to figure some things out. Most of them are fairly self-explanatory in terms of signing up, but also that's usually where you have to pay, like you put in your credit card information. You don't really want to give all that data to your developer if you're, if it's your co-founder, it's fine, but if it's some random person you're hiring, there's a reason. All these tools are built to separate out owner and billing from developer case for exactly this reason of like you can give permission to a developer and let them do your job while you still retain ownership. Does that make sense?
First, can I ask you to go back to the slide where you have the list of the five? And
Which one?
I assumed that you had like a closing slide. Maybe it was just
No, I didn't.
because I missed the first two. So I
Oh,
error tracking and
analytics, yes.
second question. I see a lot of the costs as free, and as a developer, I have like an immediate recoil. I'm like, they're not free. That takes like days. Can you speak a little bit about the person?
Yeah, sure. So obviously they vary. Developer costs when you're building this is obviously the biggest thing. All of these things I put in here, like I think they're all minimal because you're not doing, like almost anything, you can do it super hard, you can add tons of features, or you can do the minimum. Like literally to add Sentry, like you should be able to add Sentry to a web app in less than an hour. So it's not free, but I'm assuming your development is a lot more than an hour, right? So it is a minimum cost, but it is a cost. I also, as a developer, like I basically put all those, like I would always put all these things in anything I built, because otherwise it's really, you can't support the system, right? Because your client's gonna call you and like, hey, everything's broken. And you're gonna be like, nope, it works for me. I don't know what's going on. And without these tools, you have no idea what's going on. So that's, so free, so yeah, but that's true. Cost is talking about the other tool you're using. All of those have free tiers. That's not the time to install it. And that's why I kind of put those like difficulty of like how hard, that's super swag. Like most of these things are much less than a day to put in the minimal for me, but like not everybody's the same. I've obviously done it before. I wouldn't be talking about this. So it does vary. But yeah, it is not free in terms of time. And I guess as a part of that, as a founder, one of the reasons I want you to be able to ask for these things, because the developers should come back and say, oh, that is not free, I'm gonna add a cost. It shouldn't be huge, but you will never get it. Like if you don't ask for it, they won't do it. Some shops will. They'll likely be more expensive than another bid you've gotten because they do that extra work sort of automatically because they know about the problems that you're gonna have like the day after release, and they're sort of planning for them. So that's a trade-off. But if your budget can't afford those shops, if you ask for these things, most of the developers will be like, oh yeah, I can go do it. And so what's the cost? If they haven't done it, they should be able to spin up and add them fairly easily. Yep.
So you mentioned mobile SEO experience building them. Are you familiar with how retention determines your app store ranking? Like, is there any, does that count as like where your app ranks in the app store, your retention rate?
Yeah, I have no idea. I think, I guess I would argue that most people that tell you they know and they don't work for Apple and Google are full of shit, right? So there's a couple people that own that algorithm, and none of them are here, would be my guess. So I don't know, but it is going to be based on popularity at some point, right? How many people download? The ones that get downloaded more, popularity is going to go up. But I don't know what the magic is. Yeah, awesome. Thanks, guys. Thanks for all the questions.
All right, folks, we are going to get started again at 2:15, so we have a few minutes. We're going to talk about open source and teams working together. Give us about 7 more minutes. Thank you. All right, folks, it's time to kick off the next session. So if you could take your seats, that would be awesome. Trying to figure out how to get the music off. Come down, gather round. All right, music is killed. All right, thanks for coming, everyone. We have a panel discussion next. We have Bo and Gina and Andy. They're going to talk about open source software and how teams can work together. Many companies use open source. And so they have some thoughts on that. So we'll hear from them, and then presumably the audience can also maybe ask some questions. I know we're on a bit of a tight schedule, but maybe we'll have time for that. Anyway, so let's give them a round of applause and thank them for joining us, and let's hear what they have to say.
Thank you all for being here. I wanted to just start off with brief introductions. My name is Gina Helfrich. I'm the Director of Communications and Culture at NumFocus, which is a nonprofit that exists to support open source scientific computing tools. And for a lot of people, that means your whole data science stack. I'd like to give Travis and Andy an opportunity to just share a little bit about themselves and their experience both working in open source and on startups. So can we start with Travis?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Gina. It's a pleasure to be here. Love NumFocus. Been associated with them for a while. And I love open source and I love business. And it's kind of an unusual combination. Sometimes my open source friends think I'm too business focused, and my business focused friends think I'm too open source focused. So I can anger people on both sides. But the thing I love about open source is the community. I'll say that over and over again because it's what drew me into it and what kept me into it. And it's why I continue to enjoy working in SciPy. I started with the SciPy project years ago as a grad student, kind of felt drawn to help the fledgling array community by helping to contribute to NumPy, merging NumArray and Numeric. And then since then, then I left academia, did a lot of that work as a grad student academic. Then I left academia to pay the bills and feed my family. So I ended up going to businesses, then just trying to figure out, well, how do we combine these? How can I work at a business and contribute or support community-based open source? So that's been a little bit of my story.
Thank you, Gina and Travis. My name's Andy Terrell. I run the data team at Rex, which is a startup here in town that does real estate. I also advise several companies, so Kind Health, Saturn Cloud, and a few more on how to build their tech teams and run technology. I got my start in open source, I think, 2006. Actually, I think it was I emailed Travis back then, as way back in the day. We were working on SymPy and working on the very core data science type topics. And since then, I've helped start about 4 companies, including Anaconda with Travis and some others here in town, and kind of always building off the open source kind of community platform. So I've got a lot of experience, going from zero to a full company technical stack on open source software and how that integrates with the community and also integrates with enterprise and larger companies and things like that. So it's kind of where I come from.
Great, thank you. So just to make sure that everybody's operating on the same basis, I thought it'd be useful if we could kind of talk about what we mean when we say open source, and maybe wrapped into that. I've seen recent statistics that 98% or more of proprietary software is built using open source. And so what is it about open source that is making it so powerful for business?
So I guess let me kind of start and because I know Travis could talk a little bit more about the community side. I could talk more about the technical side of this. So there's, open source in and of itself is just code that is open that anybody can look at. That was the baseline definition. And if you look back in the 70s, it kind of got started as a movement for helping companies or helping people share code. And then throughout the 80s and 90s, it kind of morphed into different sorts of things. And today, most enterprise software, it used to be enterprise software was all closed source, and you couldn't look at the code. You just install the binary and you let it go and you called support. Today, it's almost default, the rule that you have to give out the source of some part of that code. And a lot of it's because a lot of eyeballs, more eyeballs, all bugs are shallow is the kind of the rule. So the more people have touched this code and seen it can actually, you're going to have fewer bugs, but also more people are able to use it. And so the real draw for a lot of folks is just, if it's code that I can manipulate myself, I can redistribute it myself, I can change it to my use case, then it's a lot more valuable. I can also hire people. I don't have to pay people, a lot of money to learn a piece of software over like the 20, 30 years of a software's life. It's like a lot more users. So you can hire right away for people who can actually edit that software, and you can actually engage with the community. Now with that, like there's a huge shade, like all sorts of shades of gray, and like what that means. And I think Travis works with a lot more communities than I do these days, so maybe you can take that side of it.
Oh, great! Yeah, give me that really hard one.
Yep.
not sure I can hit that ball out of the park. So I started a company called Anaconda about 7 years ago now. I left that company full time, still on the board, still work with the company. But I started a company called Quansight, which is an incubation company, trying to incubate other companies to build on open source. And one of them that just spun out is called Open Teams. A couple of my co-founders are here in the audience, Open Teams. Open Teams, its whole purpose is to work with the particular kinds of communities in open source, particular kinds of open source projects. We call them community first open source, term I'm trying to popularize. Community first open source is a open source that you have two kinds, in my view. You got top down. A lot of businesses have caught on to, hey, open source is a way to recruit people. There's 4 verbs people talk about with respect to open source. Can I run it? Can I see it? Can I distribute it? Can I, what's the 4th word?
Modify.
Modify it, thank you, yeah. Can I modify it? And a lot of people, that's kind of that's the golden standard of whether it's officially open source or not. And I agree with those. But the impact of that is really what's more interesting from my perspective, is what kind of community do you generate? A lot of companies out there are saying, hey, I can get people to come on open source if I make an open source project, but then they maintain control of the governance. So the project is not community governed, it's governed by a person at a company. Maybe they don't really let you have pull requests. Pull requests go behind a corporate firewall, some conversation happens that nobody sees, then they get accepted or not accepted. There's different kinds of open source that are emerging out there. I'm very much a supporter of the transparent community open source, where people can basically come together, learn from each other. They can be diverse communities, and it kind of just depends on you, your passion and your interest coming to the project that lets it go forward. I'm interested in helping those communities thrive and not be stunted in their funding. So how do you help communities like that get funded? That's my particular interest right now.
And to add on to if this is the first time ever hearing about open source software, there's a lot of debate online about licensing and what people can and can't do with the software and things like that. Probably too nuanced to get into here, but the OSI, which is the Open Source Initiative Institute, is a group of lawyers who've come and like sealed like these are the open source licenses of like what it means to use a piece of code. But I think in general, like the broader community of we want to share code, make it open, and take those 4 verbs and apply them to a code is generally what I kind of say when I mean open source.
What do you think? I don't know if this is the wrong. Maybe I pushed the wrong button. Thank you. What do you think are the main blockers that are preventing business and startups from sort of getting the best benefit out of open source right now?
I guess I can start. Actually, knowledge. One of the challenges. There's a lot of open source out there. I think 3 million libraries. Libraries.io had. There's just a lot. So it can be really confusing. Actually, you come and you're a startup. Okay, I want to have some open source software. Even what to use can be confusing. So knowledge certainly. That can be a challenge. I think the other blocker is understanding all those projects are not created equal, in the sense that because it's so easy to put a project out there, some people do, and it can be wonderful, but maybe you don't know how deep the project goes. What's the health of that project? What's the bus factor is sometimes a term that we use about how many buses have to hit people before the project dies. It's kind of a negative thing to say, but the idea is just how many people support this project? What's the health?
Yeah, I would sum it up in like trust, right? Like if I put this piece of software into my company and I build a company based on the technology, based on the software, can I trust that it's going to be maintained and updated and that I can keep it running? And I think it comes down to like, yeah, like governance structure, like, I mean, if you have a set of people who's going to put a new license on something that says you can't use this for, I don't know, bus services or something. So now, like, well, that would be a really kind of bad thing if you run a bus services based on a piece of software. They decide to change their license. But we trust that they won't do that because they're an open source community and they have come to guidance and understanding of what it means to give out their software. And well, that one's a little esoteric example. There's definitely examples like that, especially if you work with, like, for example, military use cases and whatnot. But then there's also on the other side is like license terms. Like if you have a legal team, especially in a very large company, you care about things like patents and intellectual property, which some communities don't really value very much. They think it's like vaporware or something, but that's not quite how the legal team sees it. so you have to navigate some of those details, and that's actually where, as people grow, what's happening is companies like Travis's company become great partners with larger companies, so that they get to navigate some of those tougher issues, but they also get the fact that they use a better supported tool. It's widely distributed and it's supported by thousands of people. I mean, the reason we all use AWS is like, oh yeah, if we go down, that means Netflix goes down. If Netflix goes down, the world is on fire. Therefore, my system will come back up. Right? So we trust that AWS is going to run because Netflix runs on AWS. I mean, the same thing is true for all your software. So that's one reason you pick communities that you can trust.
Yeah.
What do you think, kind of coming from the other side of it, that the communities who are maintaining those tools are looking for from the startups and businesses that are, creating so much value on essentially their volunteer time a lot of the times?
Yeah, so I guess another hat I wear is that I play the president of NumFocus board, and so I help with them a lot to try to figure this out. And at the end of the day, those software communities are people who want to share their code, and sometimes for data scientists, they come out of the scientific community. Sometimes it's enterprise, like the Apache Foundation is much more with corporations and enterprise. But the thing I think that they want, I'm good, okay. I think the thing they want more than anything is just, one, recognition of their software and kudos for maintaining this thing, but also, sponsorship and to keep them doing these things. I think a lot of people think, oh, I don't have to pay a license fee because it's open source, but then if you don't pay a license fee, then that trust of the community that was supporting that tool will start to wane because they just don't have enough time to support everybody. And so while a lot of communities want to support people, things like Patreon and TideLift and a lot of other and a NumFocus sponsorship, and there's a lot of sponsorships going on these days, are all there to try to help maintainers keep the lights on and keep working on their code, but also maintain all the bugs. And sometimes it's just like, hey, you've got a circle, like your CI, your continuous integration system is broken, or you need a better web page, and just chip them, you need 10K or something to hire the person to get this done. And so there's things like that happen, but also just sponsorship from organizations to say, we use that piece of software and we believe in it, we want it to maintain its value to the world.
Yeah, a brief comment, and great to hear a question or comment from the audience too. If you contribute a lot of time to a particular piece of software, it's really exciting and part of the community building aspect when people contribute back. When they say, oh, here's it, and I'm going to give you something back. And it's equally disheartening and upsetting when basically people do something very, very related and don't cooperate. They don't contribute back. One of the frustrations I've been having over the past year and a half is watching these enormous, the TensorFlow, the PyTorch, the enormous array computing activity. For 20 years, we're screaming at people to pay attention to arrays. Array computing matters. No, object-oriented is all that matters. No, object-oriented is all that matters. No, array is important. And all of a sudden, over the past 3 years, everybody's doing arrays, but I can count on one hand the number of conversations I've actually had with anybody on that front. Like Amazon just called, we had a great call today with Amazon, trying to think about, okay, how do we actually rally the community around an open differentiable array community? But I had to go. All this development takes place, and there's no cooperation back. So I think that's the thing most communities want from companies is just, hey, I'm using it, and hey, here's some things I'd like to see, as opposed to, thank you very much, I'll go rewrite the world, or even fork and not give back and copy without contributing back. That's what creates most tension, I think.
Is this your Carly Rae Jepsen moment? You want someone to call you, maybe? Sorry.
I love it.
Yeah, I want to echo a lot of what you're saying. As a committer on a couple of open source Apache projects and others, getting feedback is just as important as like sponsorship and like bug reports, feature prioritizations, and logos are really important, even more important than sponsorships. Just say like, hey, we are a big company and we're using this open source software. And then on that open source webpage, it's just like, bam, used by these big companies. And that builds the trust when other companies are looking. They're like, oh, well, like large banks or big tech companies are using this software. I can feel safe with that.
We can, I think we have, we're sort of like coming towards the end of the time, so I think we can open up for more questions and discussion if anyone has one.
But I'll still listen. In terms of when a company shouldn't open source some secret sauce, how do you go about that? Like when should companies not open source?
Question was, when should companies not open source? And what are the different parameters or things you think about when deciding that?
Oh, yeah. Thanks. I mean, I'm a big believer in the, I think it was Tom Preston at GitHub who said open source almost everything. But at the same time, you have to ask yourself, what is the core value your business is providing? So, like, for example, my business today is a real estate business. I'm not going to give you my engine that tells you how to price my homes, right? But I would probably be very open to open sourcing the thing that builds out all my infrastructure and gives out the ways of testing different data science models and things like that. And largely, like for me, in like putting the company hat on, I do it because I want people to be able to send their resume to me with a bug fixed in my code. So it's the very like greedy kind of side of it. But the other side is that, yeah, I mean, the things we've built are very interesting and helps the rest of the community who's building similar things to us. And so you can build a community around that and whatnot. And so probably, a lot of folks, if you're in that first, like, as you like to call it, the ramen years of your company, focusing on giving back might not be the first thing you do. But as you start to get bigger and you can support it, because starting and using open source internally, it's going to help you get farther faster, cheaper. But later on, you want to be able to give that back to the community so that the thing you took can actually continue to grow the communities. But at the same time, if you open source something, you have to be able to support it a bit. Like we're talking about governance and trust. If you can't provide that trust to your user base, I mean, if you just release a piece of library out there that does something and then breaks somebody else's code, they're going to come try to find you to help them fix it. And if you don't have any way of one, even talking to them, even taking or even the time to even acknowledge they exist, probably not the right idea to go and push your stuff open source. So there's you can put it out there and dump it, but that doesn't really help anybody. If you're out there trying to build a little bit more of a community around what you're doing and get eyeballs to your company, that's really valuable. And so I usually look at it from my lens on can I even support this if it did actually be something people wanted to touch and use?
Yeah, that's great. I think if there are any, you might have agreements with sponsors or other people's data. There's maybe restrictions you can't open source because you can't sort of make it transparent. Certainly, your value proposition. Understand your value proposition. You don't need to open source that necessarily. It might make sense to open source the code around that value proposition if you're actually monetizing or you're earning money some other way. But you need to be careful about that. I really underscore, if you're going to open source something, be intentional about building a community. It doesn't have to be a massive community. You don't have to have 24/7 customer support laid out or on an open source project, but just say, okay, I'm going to take at least half a person's time or some of a person's time is going to be dedicated to that project. If you can't do that, probably don't open source it. You know, just, you can make the GitHub repository public, I suppose, if you want. But at that point, it may not be worth it. So I think it can be intentional. I agree that when projects become really valuable to be open source, is probably, that the tough decision is when they become popular enough that you might think about open sourcing them, is when typically the investors are going to say, don't open source that, right? Because that has value. That's usually when things go wrong, because be careful about where you think the value is and where the rest of the world is. You can actually think you're holding on to something, meanwhile the world grows around you and obviates your advantage.
Yeah, on a note on that, when you're taking money from VCs, if you have technology that's your company's based around and you want it to be an open technology, yeah, open source immediately. Don't even ask them before you take money, because like you have an open source project and they give you money, there's no questions asked. But if you take money and then there's like, oh yeah, we're gonna open source this code, then you've got like lawyers up the you know.
Well, you can get good investors these days, actually. So. The investors are getting smarter, but yes, sometimes it can be difficult.
Can I comment on that as well? I worked at a company where we had an open core model, and like if you're making money off of support and services, you could open source your code, and that'll just like make it easier to support people. But for open core model, if you're selling to businesses, for example, our strategy was whatever it is that can get it in an engineer's hands to test for free and play out and like show to their manager, look, I played around with this, it's free, it's open source, that's great. And then when they say, okay, great, now how do we pay somebody to support it and add features and give us like security and all these like scalability and reliability and all these like enterprise features. Those are the things that we kept closed source.
Yeah.
And the core part of it was open source. And it actually evolves over time, because that open core part, it's like somebody else builds a security feature on it, and you're like, okay, well, am I going to let them sell that? No, I'll just open source my security feature, and then hopefully we figured out something else to make money off of that can stay closed source. So it just rolls, and you're eventually open sourcing everything, but stay like 1 year ahead of like closed source time.
Yeah, and just I don't know if to the point about open core, that's a business model for selling open source software, and there's several of these around. I think there's a Dan Katz or maybe I forget the lady who has the lemonade stand that shows all the different models.
Nadia,
yeah, Eggwald. So it's definitely someone to look up. And the open core model, like if you are building technology, like giving away something for free and then charging, and that actually makes one thing that's really good about that. It can also educate you on like what you would open source out of your maybe non-technical business, if that's the case, is that they will often not make free things like LDAP connectors, right? Like LDAP is like this old way of connecting to a server that all your people are on, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense for the open source community because nobody runs LDAP at home, but every big company in the world runs it, so it's something that people are going to pay for and support. But so there are lots of times features that enterprises will pay for or small business will pay for that the developer doesn't really need to pay for, and it's more valuable that way. So that's another like really great model that has been working for a lot of companies. Although there's always the big question of how many unicorns are built on open core, and that's a tough one.
There is. There's a debate about open core right now. The Open Core Summit in San Francisco, there's some people concerned about the cloud vendors coming in and getting rid of their business model. In many cases, that's true, because the cloud vendors basically, they love open source because it's how they get more compute. They want everybody just releasing stuff of open source. So there's some tension going on right now, some back and forth. I like the complementary idea. It's similar to open core, but it's kind of a little bit more on the side of I'm just selling another product. And you use the open source, the virality of open source is very important. Exactly the way you said it was perfect. If you have a piece of software that by sharing, you increase the number of users and people are pointing each other to use cases, and especially if that thing can then increase demand for your other thing you're selling, then it's kind of the razor blade, razor model, and that's a well-known business model that can thrive. And then it does become some of the complementary features might be supplanted by open source features, so you have to keep them, you have to make sure you're constantly understanding that dynamic. So there can be definitely challenges, but you know, I think the experimentation is wonderful, right? But people need to really understand the value, and people do today much more than 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I was convincing people to use open source. Today, it's all over the place. It's a much easier conversation. Now people are doing some silly things, like assuming that the community is going to take care of any problems that come up because they're relying on it. And no, unless you got a contract with somebody, nobody's
Yeah.
got your back.
How many people have heard of LeftPad? Does anyone know what LeftPad is here? Okay, so yeah, we talk about risks of open source, right? Sometimes the infrastructure breaks, and you're like, what happened? And so LeftPad is a great story where somebody changed some piece of code called LeftPad that all it did was add white space to the left side of your string. So fairly innocuous little thing,
JavaScript
thing,
library.
but it broke like half the community's code, which then broke a lot of companies' code, which caused the internet to go outraged for a day. So things like that do happen. So if you are going down the open source route, like I think the gentleman right before us was talking about how to engage good shops and whatnot, yeah, you have to have some support to manage some of those details. So,
And I can hook you up with several companies that'll do that.
yeah.
Other questions?
Yes. That would be. It depends. I mean, so you would just need
Maybe
to work
once
that
you
out.
could do that.
Yeah.
And then the community would not work with you again.
Well, I think there is like options where people will use your code, and then like you may have a derivative product on top of that, and that's what they was talking about, like the complementary product. So a good example is like Percona, right? Percona didn't develop MySQL, and they weren't the ones who went all through the pain. But as soon as like Oracle like went and changed everything, Percona's popped up and started selling Percona Server, which is effectively a supported MySQL server. Now, MySQL still exists as a project to the side, and Percona is a supported enterprise version on top of that. And so everything integrates still. You use Percona, you call them, you pay them their ridiculous rates on their contributors and technical folks, but your stuff doesn't stop working. So in some sense, like what you said, there's a grain of truth that you can do that sort of thing, but you always have to work with your community. And if you make your community upset at you because you just started selling things out, like that tends to make things go bad, and you lose that trust. So, but you can start something to the side, typically using that innovation.
Yeah, and especially just with the right kind of connections back to the community to help them understand they're being supported, it can work very well. But it does take some conversations and some messaging.
Panache.
Panache? Yeah. Yeah, you do have to communicate.
So we're coming up to the end of our time. So I wondered if you all had kind of some, final thoughts you want to leave. There's probably a room full of founders or future founders. What's kind of the takeaway you hope that they would go home with?
Definitely start a company around open source. As you do that, recognize the need to connect with those communities and to support them, but build something of value. Recognize that open source, my view of the world of open source is fantastic infrastructure. This is where I sometimes, I'm not an open source purist in the sense I don't think all software should be open source. I think most of it will be open source, probably 75, 80% in the long run. Maybe it's only 70. But the more open source there is, the more problems you can solve, more polished products you can produce that use it as a baseline. But we can get far better at using open source, supporting it appropriately, and then building better solutions for people. It's a little bit, actually, as long as you're in the industry, you realize how you're embarrassed still. I'm embarrassed at the solutions that that are sold to customers right now. They could be so much better if they would just do the last mile solution on top and then support those open source communities, as opposed to reinventing the wheel all the time. And so that's the vision, that's the future I'm looking for and looking to support, looking to try to help build, but only with the support of founders, hopefully some people in the audience.
And so my take is like engage with build on top of open source because it's the fastest way to get there. and it's at a great community. And that community are people who are doing this open source work because they want to give back to the world. It's not that they, well, there are some people like, oh, I want to get famous or something, but that really isn't it. It's usually I want to give back to the world, and the way I know how to do that is through software. And so if you're using their code or their products to make really awesome products and selling it, you'll find more allies there than you could ever think about. And so don't view them as like something you can just take from. View them as a partner in getting to your goals. And so in that, like, your way might change quite a bit, but I really encourage people, don't think of open source as a transaction, think of it as a partnership for building a better world.
Well, thank you, Andy and Travis, and thank you all for participating.
All right, folks. So
Development, having it for the communication part of the business. So having wikis, having playbooks, and all those kind of things is very important. And the last thing is management. At this point, I'm assuming that all of us understand about Agile, about Scrum, but the thing is that some of the rituals within those philosophies and practices are very important. And most importantly, having very short periods of iterations and releases. So what I'm saying is that don't try to have a release for more than 2 months, for example. Try to have something for 1 month. Try to have an iteration planning for just 1 week, and having continuous visibility of what the team is building. And obviously having boards, using your Trello, GitHub, etc., for having perspective of what the team is doing. So consider this again. This is not supposed to work for every company. I think there are some elements that I just highlight that is very important to consider, but again, there might be some constraints as well. So one is that if we don't introduce all these elements, we might find some offset in the initial investment, so we might find a more expensive strategy if we don't know how to navigate on those challenges. The second point is that the distance between the development team and the business unit needs to be very tight. Some of the development teams that are outside of the business office or the onshore office might feel segregated, might feel that they are not part of the career path that the company is building. So it's very important to have these continuous trips, visiting the nearshore office, visiting the teams, or probably let them come to the States, for example, and be cultivated by the culture of the company. And the last thing is the cultural shock, which is something that we need to take care of. So takeaways, my conclusion is that we are just starting to see the advantages, but also the challenges of having nearshore strategies. But I believe that doing it right can have a great outcome. So 2 points that I want to highlight. The first one is this is a strategy that I have seen that companies can add different factors for competing against other technology businesses, not only attracting talent, but also expanding market share. So it's important to consider this, and I go back to the HEV case, which is something that I really admire. And the second point, people like Martin Fowler and other software engineers are talking about this. This is not just about building a nearshore office, is how can we let this office evolve into a non-shore office. So meaning that this office that is also producing part of the code, part of the platform, they have the capacity of touching another market and expanding the business to that area, as we saw with HEV. So hopefully this was interesting for you. I'm going to be at the back with some Topo Chico Sangria, which is a flavor that it's only distributed in Mexico. And well, that's it. Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, thank you, Eduardo. Appreciate it. Appreciate it. Our next lightning talk is here, Sarah Spear, the engineer. My unconventional path to software development, right? Mm-hmm. All right. Well, welcome, Sarah. Let's give her a warm welcome.
Sure this works. Hopefully this works. We'll give it a second. Well, hello. I'm Sarah Spear, the engineer. And maybe. Hello. Well, this'll do. Sweet. Great. So I'm gonna just share a little bit with you about how I became a software engineer. I have not used Google Presentation for this yet, so we're gonna learn together. No one ever told me it was an option, which is funny because I actually went to a school that was really focused on math and science. But we were in 2004 and, it was a much different time. It was very, very simple. And, some people just know exactly what they want to do, right out of high school. This was when I was graduating, and I am not one of those people. I am very jealous of those people. I actually had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. I had no plan. I mean, how is everybody supposed to know the answers when you are 18 years old? So I went to the person that I thought might be able to give me some advice, my high school guidance counselor. And she told me that women go into marketing. And I was like, okay. So that's what I did. I went into marketing. I got a degree in marketing and a degree in graphic design. And we all know how lucrative art school is. And then all of a sudden, it was 2009. Does everybody remember 2008, 2009 and how the economy was doing? It was a tough year for a lot of us. So I was working part-time at the Apple Store, and I was like, this is great. It's paying my bills. I'm just going to keep doing that. So here I was with 2 college degrees, working retail just to stay afloat. It was great. I liked it. Actually, not that bad. Could have been worse. I could have just not had a job at all. But then I somehow fell into operations, and then I stayed there for 7 years. But I did do a lot of cool things. I trained a bunch of Apple Store employees and traveled around. I edited a book. I'm officially a book editor. I went to a bunch of cool states, including Idaho, and a bunch of cool countries. And yeah, I mentored a bunch of startups. I actually ran a startup accelerator here in Austin and became a professional actor and comedian. Performed on the stage as a lot of big comedians at the Comedy Cellar. That was pretty cool. Joined a couple startups, quit, got let go, and just realized man, I'm not happy. I didn't actually want to do anything that I was doing. So that made me really sad. I hadn't been writing any code. I didn't even know how to write a line of code. And, this is how I felt. This is probably more accurate of how I felt. So I decided I'm actually going to do something about this. I was lucky enough to be in a position where I had some resources and a great network. So I started learning. I took a few all-day boot camps in Python and SQL. I did some online learning in a few different languages. I was offered 2 online learning scholarships. But it gets really hard when it's 11 o'clock at night and you're alone on your couch and you have nobody but a very quiet Slack channel to try and get support. And this is definitely a viable option for some people, but I also couldn't hold myself accountable enough to make this happen. So I was I really want to do this thing. I'm gonna do this thing. I got to figure out something else because this wasn't working. Just wasn't working for me. And honestly, I felt the whole time just being who am I kidding? I can't do this. I went to art school, I'm really good at Photoshop, but I can't do anything else. So, but here's the thing, that didn't go away. I still feel that way as a software engineer. I think a lot of us feel imposter syndrome. I think a lot of us kind of, wonder, are we worthy? And I just didn't know that that was a very normal feeling at the time. And so I was okay, what's another path I can do? Because I really want to try this thing. And I was kind of getting to the point where the startup that I was working with wasn't a really good fit for me. I kind of had a feeling that we would part ways. The CEO and I were just we want to run the company in completely different ways. And, that's never a good thing because the founder's going to be the one that stays in the company and then the employee's not going to be the one. So I was starting to make plans. I was cool, I'm going to do this. I'm going to go to a boot camp because that seems like the most viable option. But then I was oh my gosh, they're so expensive. Oh my gosh, it's really time consuming. But also I might not have a job, so that could be okay. It's not a CS degree. Is anyone going to take me seriously? It's really scary, right? That's terrifying. I'm going to change my career in my mid-30s? Like, I'm crazy. And, you know, it's easier just to keep doing what I'm doing. I know these are like a lot of normal feelings that people feel when they're like going to switch their whole entire life trajectory around in a matter of a couple of months. But as I did more research and talked to more people that went through boot camps and talked to people that actually had jobs, I realized it was actually really good for a career change. And it was a really good experience. And when I thought about it, it was actually way cheaper than going back to a university and paying for a 4-year degree. And I already had 2 of those already, so did I need a 3rd one? It seemed silly. And like it would grow my network. You know, I would know more software engineers by being a part of something that had more software engineers. And I was literally gonna be job ready. So I was like, I'm gonna do this. I took out a loan. I got kind of let go from my startup. It was like the time to do this. I was like, I've got nothing to lose. So I did it. And then I was ready for a job. I was like, cool, I did this thing. That was really hard. I ugly snot cried in front of multiple teachers and multiple students and learned, you know, this whole new way of thinking in 12 weeks, which when you think about it is kind of insane. Well, the job hunt was also really hard. I was like, I think that was the easy part of this whole thing. This is actually the hard part now, finding the job. So yeah, it's hard. It was hard for me. Instead of just going around and being like, hey, I know how to build spreadsheets and like run a program, I was like, oh, I have to do whiteboarding and I have to do coding challenges and I have to answer all these really tough questions. And also I have to prove to you that my last decade of experiences wasn't a total waste and I am very valuable. So yeah, it was really hard. But, you know, I learned a lot during that process and I was able to land a job, a really cool job. I still work in a startup, but I get to do a lot of really cool things. And what I really learned here, these are the things that don't suck about this whole entire process, was that anybody can really do this. Nobody ever told me that software engineering was like a path to success. And I wish I had just been told that. Sometimes it helps for somebody to just hear, this is an option. This is something you can do. And also anybody can do this. You know, if you really would like hunker down and learn and be passionate and like put energy into this, like you can do this. It's hard, but like so are a lot of other things and people do this, so like you can too. And my previous experience was relevant and important, and that's actually what got me in the door to a lot of these other companies when I was interviewing. So I didn't have to pretend that I was like somebody I wasn't. I could just be like, oh, I did all these other things, but like I do this now too. And, you know, building and maintaining the network was super crucial. I come across as a really big extrovert, but I'm not. I actually really like to just be at home alone and like read books and not be around people. And it's really hard to, you know, go to networking events and like reach out to people on LinkedIn when you are like terrified of what people are going to respond with. But it was crucial. And I also learned that my soft skills were just as important as my technical skills. I had a lot of people tell me that, you know, if you're a good teammate and you're easy to work with, like we would much rather have that than like somebody that's the best technically savvy person in the entire world and a pain in the ass to work with. So I was like, cool, well, at least I'm mostly a delight, so like this should not be too bad. So yeah, that's kind of like how I got to where I was, and I'm really happy at my startup. I wish I had done this 5 years ago. I've learned a lot. I learn a lot every single day. I, you know, still bang my head against the keyboard. I still feel like I'm unworthy, but I'm having way more fun doing this than I ever thought I would. I feel like this every single day. Everybody know who this is? This is actually, it's me. Do you see that? Yeah. So I'll go ahead and wrap up, but if anyone has any questions or wants to learn a little bit more about what I do, I work at a company called Stoplight. We help companies build and maintain their own APIs, and we're focused on enterprise, but we do have a lot of really great open source and just developer tools, free API designer tools as well. It's a pretty cool company, and I get to do a lot of front end, back end, all the things. It's really, really, really fun. But yeah, thanks so much for listening to my story, and I'll pass it back over to Damon / whoever is next.
All right, so those are only 2 official ones on the schedule, but we have a couple of late submissions, so we can keep the show going here. So do you want to go first? Okay. Did you say your name was David? Okay, David from Open Teams. He's going to talk about open teams. All right, so let's keep it to 10 minutes or less. He's going to do 10 minutes on that. And then Keith Casey's going to come up here, and he's going to talk about, I don't know what it will be, but I'm sure it'll be fascinating. So we're gonna do this. And then it's about all the time we have, so. All right. Let's see. Friends helping friends. All right. Let's see. You have a nice background. Your display settings. Yeah, the arrangement. Go to arrangement and then turn mirroring off. Or on, depending on what you want. Okay. All right.
All right, I'm ready.
All right.
All right, I wanted to talk with you guys about Open Teams real quick today. We were founded to try to address a very specific problem. In general, it's sustainability in open source software. When we talk about sustainability, we can mean multiple things. We can talk about community health, we can talk about funding, we can talk about people getting recognition for the work that they do as part of community health. Open Teams has chosen to focus on two primary aspects for sustainability in open source. The first of them is helping everyone be recognized for their contributions. Today, it's very easy for people to get recognized for contributions to open source software if you've made a code commit. But what if you were a project manager? You know, you might show up in the JIRA history, maybe. What if you were doing marketing efforts? What if you met a booth at a recent open source conference? You know, do you end up in the contributors mentions for the project? And does it state that that's what you did? Do you get recognized for that particular activity that you pursued? In addition, there's the funding aspect of it. How can we help the developers of open source software to be compensated for the contributions to the community? So by focusing on those two things, we think we can actually make a big, big dent and a big difference in it. Open Teams accomplishes this through two different approaches, which they're going to sound like two sides that aren't necessarily related, but I'm going to prove to you that they are related. So the first of them is making it so that if you sign up to the site, you can be recognized for what you've done. You can raise your hand and say, I wrote documentation for that project. Or you could sign up, and say, I know somebody who wrote the entire test harness for this other project, for SciPy, for example, and nominate them to be recognized. So I'll give you a quick preview of what this looks like. So if I were a project, let me find a project that I'm actually a leader of. So as a leader of a project, I can come in here and see who the leaders are. I can see who the project users are. And I can see who has been using this project. And so far, nobody has claimed that they use it. But I can, yeah, this is why I can't actually see anything. I haven't logged in. By the way, if you want to create an account, if you have a GitHub account, all you got to do is click Login with GitHub. Or GitLab if you prefer. So I can come right in here and I can say thank you to somebody for making a contribution to my project. For example, I'm going to thank Eunice right now. So now I've recognized Eunice for having contributed to a marketing campaign that we've been working on for the past couple of weeks. Another thing that I could have done on another project is nominate somebody for a contribution that they could choose to accept and then would be recognized or acknowledged by a project leader And it shows up on your profile, it shows up on the project's profile, it shows up in a variety of places. Now, the main aim here is just so that the things that are difficult to quantify, difficult to find in the commit histories or in Jira, end up showing up somewhere at least, so that you can build up a reputation over time. Now, there's that second part that I told you that I was going to tie this together, which is funding. We don't have a demonstration of this in action just yet, but what we plan to build is a marketplace where organizations that want to be funded to do work on open source software and organizations that want to fund work on open source software, let's say you depend heavily on SciPy or you depend heavily on Dask, you can have a place to go to say, these are the things that I would be willing to, that I'm interested in receiving funding for, or these are the things I'd be interested in being paid for, paying to have done, and we'll play the matchmaker and set it up so that the consumers of the open source software can be connected with someone who will do that work and get the focus on the issues that they need paid attention to on this platform. Now, who do you think should do the work, right? Who should be compensated for doing the work on the open source projects? It should be the developers, but how do you find them? Well, if you've gone in here and you've got your healthy interaction between the project leaders and the community members, recognizing the different contributions, you've got a whole candidate set for the team to pull together for a funded project to make an advance on the roadmap. Now, today, a lot of stuff is kind of like, the analogy I use is, a lot of open source is kind of like barn raising, right? Everyone gets together, pitches in to build the barn. Well, it's time for things to get a little bit more sophisticated. I think we need builders. We need building companies that can stand up and say, I will help address the commercial needs while not totally disrupting the community needs. And that's one of the key insights that I hope that we can address, which is that commercial companies have specific sets of needs around commitments from the people that they pay to get work done, and the projects need autonomy, so we've got to find a way to bridge the gap and get people who are working on the project paid while not disrupting the independence of the projects. And our hope is that that will be open teams. So I'd like to invite you to sign up, take a look, especially if you work in open source or a user of open source. In fact, as a user, you can actually mention the ways you use open source on the platform and mention how you've applied the technologies and help us build the future. Thank you.
All right, thank you. We're seriously running out of time here, but I really want to have Keith come up here. So let's give him 5 minutes, and then we'll get the next talk started. So can you do it? Can he do it? I know you have a lot to say, but 5 minutes.
All right. I'm actually going to go without a microphone. Do I need a microphone? Am I good? Okay, cool. Hi, everybody. I'm Keith Casey. I am a security guy. I work for a company called Okta. We do single sign-on and identity management, and I wear this shirt every time I fly. The TSA loves me. So anyway, I want to be able to, Jamie came up to me right before this whole thing started. He said, hey, we've got 5 minutes. What do you want to talk about? I was like, I don't know. And I talked to my boss, and she's like, hey, what are you going to talk about? I'm like, I don't know. And I decided to talk about the thing that I find the most fun in life, and that's thinking like a bad guy. When we have to think about security, we're not just saying, what would we do? How do we get in and cause damage? How do we get access to things? We need to think like a bad guy. We need to think about what's the absolute worst possible thing that could happen in this scenario. And that's hard, because we all have a happy, cheery view of the world, right? We all want to be optimists. We want to look at our startup, look at our project, look at our organization and say, this thing's going to be great, right? I'm going to be able to quit my job in 3 months and be able to do this. And we all have this it's not a seed, it's like a foundation of optimism. The problem is the world's a lot darker than that. And the people who are out there that want to cause damage, that want to cause trouble, and just, in some cases, just want to have fun, have a lot darker view of the world. So I always advise, whether it's small companies or Fortune 500, whoever I go to visit, of how do we think like bad guys? And the first thing we have to acknowledge is we probably aren't bad guys. Bad guys have a hard time holding a job, they have a hard time having families, things along those lines. They're, the classic idea is, they're living in mom's basement wearing a hoodie 24/7, or they're from Russia. Let me just tell you, all that's bullshit. Those aren't bad, no, they're idiots, but they're not bad guys. The bad guys are the ones that want to cause serious catastrophic damage to you, to everyone around you, to organizations, to nations, to whatever. Those are the people we have to think about, all right? So we're not talking about some little punk script kiddie. We're talking about people who actually want to cause damage, probably to make a lot of money in the process. So how do we do this? First of all, we set aside our own notions. We're not thinking about us. The people on our team are probably not the ones that have to be able to come up with this. So the first thing we need to do is look at the news. Odds are there's tons of coverage about other vulnerabilities, other issues, other things that have been raised between our competitors, between our comparators, the organizations and projects we compare ourselves to. We need to see what's happened to them. Because if it happened to somebody else, it can happen to us. So that's a good first step. We need to take it a step further though. And does anyone here work for like a big company, say a couple hundred people to thousands of people? Okay, there's a few. So there's that group that everybody avoids in your company. And it's not the IT team, it's the lawyers. Go and talk to the lawyers. Go and talk to the lawyers and say, what keeps you up at night? What do you struggle with? What is the thing that you are terrified of seeing on the front page of whatever newspaper? What is the thing that you don't want to hit the front page of TechCrunch? What happens if that happens to us? Talk to the lawyers. Talk to the people who their entire job, remember, their entire focus is to protect the organization from risk. Turns out that's a lot of what our focus is in security too. Talk to them, find out what keeps them up at night. If we can do that, we can mitigate things that we probably won't think about. And in fact, that also often crosses into social engineering sort of things too, not just technical issues. And the last thing that I want to throw out, and this is actually my favorite, is the best approach by far is write a Black Mirror episode. Is anyone not familiar with Black Mirror? Okay, just in case, Black Mirror is a dystopian sci-fi series set in the near future. It's always, they take an existing set of tools, technologies, concepts, and they apply it just a little bit further. And the scary thing is, Black Mirror doesn't seem far-fetched most of the time. It actually seems really appropriate because you watch it, you go, ha. And that's the kind of thing that we need to watch out for. So that's the last thing I always try to tell companies do is, if somebody got a hold of this information, if somebody was able to access these things, what could they do with it? What's the most catastrophic thing they could do with it? How would you distort the organization? How would you damage your organization? How would you damage your customers, suppliers, vendors, partners? What would that look like? Write about that. Think about that. And then start to figure out how to address it. With that, I'm Keith Casey. Have a good one. How's time? Great.
Whose computer is this? Oh, okay. All right, so we're going to get started with our next talk. We have Kelsey and someone from Helium is coming up. Yes. Okay. Let me grab these high chairs here. That's okay. They shouldn't sit over there. No, there's people spread out. It's kind of hard to hit everyone.
Props.
Sweet. All right, let me get you a microphone as well. So I'll let you do the introductions. How about that? Okay. I'm going to give you this one, and I'm going to grab you one.
Okay, thank you.
Test, test. All right, we're going to talk about helium here, folks. Take a seat.
There you go. Thank you.
Great.
All right.
Hi, Frank.
Hello, Kelsey.
How are you today?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. Thanks, everyone, for coming out. So we're here today to discuss building a new network for IoT with Frank Mong, the Chief Operating Officer at Helium. Frank is responsible for sales, business development, and marketing at Helium. He has over 20 years of experience in the cybersecurity, networking, and software space. And just prior to joining Helium, he was SVP at Palo Alto Networks of Products and Solutions Marketing. So Frank, your company recently raised a $15 million funding round led by Multicoin Capital, which is an Austin-based firm. And in a recent blog post that one of the partners there, put out. They said that the Helium vision is the most ambitious that they've seen in the blockchain space since the advent of Ethereum, since the advent of smart contracts on Ethereum.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot for us to dive in here, to dive into here. But to start, could you tell us a little bit about the People's Network and, what about the vision at Helium, that makes what you're doing so unique?
Sure. Thank you for that intro. Hello, everybody. Hello, Austin. Thanks for joining us today. The company really has a very interesting past. So if you haven't read up on Helium, we were co-founded by Sean Fanning of Napster. You guys are all really young, so music wasn't always online, guys. All right, we had something called CDs and tape.
What?
I know, cassette tapes and 8-track and even vinyl. I know vinyl's making a comeback, but Sean Fanning really did something crazy, audacious, probably insane. Right? He took music and put it online and made it shareable from your computer to somebody else's computer. And back then it was on modems. I know everything is great now, but it wasn't all that great before. And that in doing so, he created a movement to decentralize control of digital rights, music rights in this case. That same guy and Amir Halim, who was a Quake champion from England, started this company called Helium. And what drove them to start the company was actually because they wanted to build little devices that can connect to the internet outside, not in the building where there's Wi-Fi, not sort of a foot apart using Bluetooth, but imagine little devices like a pet tracker, like a dog tracker, or someone was telling me about a fitness tracker or something. Imagine if you're running around downtown. How do you connect to the internet without cellular? You can't, right? And so what they did was they tried to use cellular tech to create devices, but doing that was incredibly hard. It's centrally owned. You got to go work with the cell companies. It's proprietary. So if any of you guys who's a hardware developer here? Hardware developers? It's not easy. It's not trivial, right? It's also expensive because it's proprietary. It's a closed system. And so at that point, they thought, great, we got to go build a network. Like to connect our little thing, whatever you want to call it, an IoT device, we need to go build our own network to connect this thing. And so now it became a passion project of building a network. And that's audacious, right, to say the least.
Seems like a chill passion project.
and that was 6 years ago, guys. That's a long time ago. But that problem statement, building a network that's ubiquitous, can connect small devices from miles away on low power, is something that the company really used to raise its seed round of funding with Mark Benioff and Ron Conway, SV Angels. And they believed in that. They thought this is long overdue, it should happen. And that same narrative is what we use to raise Series A with Vinod Khosla, Series B with Google Ventures, and of course Series C with Multicoin Capital.
And so let's talk a little bit more about the network itself and why the blockchain is critical to Helium.
Yeah, so 6 years in the making, right? 6 years of figuring out wireless technology, playing around with all kinds of different modes, whether it be a cellular or LoRa or there's tons of things out there. We've got like a closet full of hardware, just gear that we've played with. 2 years ago, we were sitting around and we said, okay, we've done thousands of POCs with different companies, building networks, getting them their application, their sensor, and we thought, what's the common denominator? The common denominator across all of our engagements with large companies and small businesses was that they did not want to build a network, period. They already have Wi-Fi. And it was like, that was a pain in the ass. And now you want to tell them to go build an IoT network? They're like, dude, this sucks, right? We're like, we know it sucks. So we sat around with a bottle of Oban in 2017. It was summer, all right? It's good stuff, 14-year. And we said, hey, what is going on out there? There's this thing called Bitcoin and Ethereum, and it's now mainstream. It's on USA Today. It's on like your Apple News feed, right? It used to be sort of this weird Satoshi character and this crazy people mining something, like makes no sense to us. Yeah. Like what's the value of this stuff? There's no value, we don't understand it. To, hey, there's like this massive like movement to this cryptocurrency blockchain thing. What if we could put Bitcoin in our wireless router? Could we then get everyone here to build the network so we don't have to build a network? Because imagine if Helium had to go build a network, we have to go raise billions of dollars, and it'll probably take us 30 years, and we'll die along the way, right? That's too long, right? We're a startup. We got to think differently. So the hack for us was iterating in that idea. Okay, well, maybe it's not Bitcoin, because Bitcoin, you guys all know, takes like cities of power to do anything useful. So we looked at all kinds of blockchain, and we thought, you know what? Nothing gives us what we need, which is if we build a decentralized network of anonymous hosts, hotspot hosts. Like if you look around, you guys, let's pretend you don't know each other, right? And everyone had a hotspot host in their home. The number one important thing for us is that these hotspots have to be able to talk to each other, and they have to be able to trust each other. So how do you do that? You have to prove your location. So we created this whole proof of coverage idea where you have to constantly prove your location. Your hotspot's gonna work really hard to prove itself so that you have a reliable network. And then you're gonna be talking to each other, creating sort of this consensus group, providing some security around this network. And that's where we ended up. We had to go build our own blockchain. So 2 years ago, that's the path we went down, building our own blockchain. The key being that that blockchain would be the incentive for us to encourage consumers to build a global, ubiquitous network. And that was key for us.
And so to that then, for consumers, what are the real incentives and some of the applications that you foresee contributors to the network kind of having the ability to recognize?
Yeah, so today there's a whole set of token economics. I think it'll take me forever to explain, but go online, helium.com.
I did read your white paper.
Wow, very impressed. I couldn't even read that thing. It's too long.
It was well written.
Oh, good. The idea is this. There is a set finite amount of mining that happens every month. So there's a mining pool for the tokens themselves, and that's a finite amount. So if you had, let's say 10 of us today in Austin, we were the first to set up a hotspot. And for this entire month, we're in September now, right? We 10 of us would divide the total mining pool. All right, and so if you're in early, you're gonna mine more of the Helium tokens. If you're in later, let's say a year from now, there's 100,000 hotspots around the world, then you divvy up the same amount amongst 100,000 hotspots. So that's sort of the idea of our token and how very simply works. So I'm just giving you guys a high level overview here. The idea is this, you guys, and we launched in Austin, Texas, by the way. So today, there's 150 or so hotspots in Austin. You can download the app Helium Hotspot on iTunes as well as Android. And you can actually see where the hotspots are in all the cities in the US. So we started here in Austin. August 1st is when we launched. And the motivation for folks to get in early is to be in early, to mine early, and have a disproportional share of that limited pool of tokens. So our tokens in our world is only available through mining. It doesn't magically come into existence. You have to have hotspots that mines, that creates that token. The other side of that is the users of the network. So we're talking about you guys, all of us here, we're hotspot hosts. You're gonna own and operate this Helium network, not me at Helium Inc. You buy it, you own it. The blockchain is public. What we're doing at Helium Inc. is we're recruiting and showing customers or users of the network that this is possible. In Austin, Texas, we have a live network. If you are Lime, you can test that network with your Lime scooters here in Austin right now.
Is
here's
using
little sensors. Yeah.
a Lime scooter the only kind of use case at the moment for these hotspots right now?
So tracking and tracing. If you in the world of product market fit, this is our product market fit. Everyone's calling us. Things that are untrackable or things that are untraceable, they're calling us to track.
Scooter.
This is our dev kit. This is our development kit. That's a sensor that's broadcasting 900 megahertz. And the hotspot here, this is the hotspot. This in your home by the window with the little antenna, I didn't plug it in. This is what's listening to that. And so that can be miles away Miles as in up to like 18 miles line of sight. Miles away talking, and this little hotspot in your home will hear it and transmit the data back to the internet to the owner of that tracker or sensor. All right, so that's how that system works. So this is what people in Austin have purchased and are now running here in their homes.
All right. So in Austin, you guys launched about, was it August 1st?
August 1st.
You said there's 150 hotspots?
150 hotspots out there providing coverage. We have customers here testing all the time.
Are there any customers here in the audience right now? Anyone who's purchased it? Okay, well, I'll give you that.
Great.
You are?
Great.
Nice.
Great.
Ooh, we should
Josh
interview
Baer.
him.
Yeah.
Josh Baer, yes. So what does it take to attain kind of full coverage of the city of Austin, the state of Texas?
It's hard to say. So when we tested coverage, because it's so vast, 900 megahertz has some interesting characteristics. So in the world of 900 megahertz, and maybe some of you guys know this already, it can go really far on narrow band. So we have it very narrow, which means it's small data packets. It's not used to watch YouTube, all right, or streaming, but to send pulses, like sending temperature data, location information, movement, sensors, stuff like that, sound. And so that kind of data, 24 bytes to like 20 kilobytes, all right, is what we're talking about. That kind of data can go far, right? And the closer you are, the broader, the bigger the bandwidth you have. The further you are, the smaller the bandwidth. And so it's physics, and it's the less buildings, the better. But if there's buildings, it's okay. Like it can cut through like concrete, can cut through wood.
Okay.
But no wireless can cut through like metal. So if you're surrounded by metal, it sucks. But those are some of the constraints. And so depending on where you are, like in the city of Austin, where downtown happens to be kind of flat, but then there's hills on the edges of town, I think. It gets kind of hilly. It changes. So we can get really great range if you're at the top of this building. It's like line of sight's far. You can see as far as the eyes can see, right? That's where the signal can go, wherever you can see. That's how far it can go, which is like miles and miles away. But if you're down on the bottom floor here, you might only get a mile or two. So it really depends.
Do you think every person in this room has a use case?
I think so. I mean, I think one of the things I found it most common use case is if you have a pet. I don't know if you guys have pets. Anyone have pets here? A couple. Like you want to track your dog or cat, and if you don't want to put a collar on, you don't want to have a digital fence of some type, this collar, this tracker I just showed you can track dogs and cats really easily. So that would be a use case. If you have, I don't think you guys are, you want to have kids? You want to track your kids without a cell phone? This would be it. You can track your kids.
So one of the things that kind of comes up for me as an investor, with things like this, we're always thinking about what's the way that you achieve some kind of critical mass, or and with Helium, your rollout strategy seems to be kind of centered around geographies. So you're rolling out city by city. So with that in mind, how do you go about kind of solving this cold start problem with crypto?
So for us, it's building a network. And the cold start problem is getting people to do it, not having to do it ourselves. Cryptocurrency and blockchain is the answer for us. I think without cryptocurrency, without this idea of a distributed ledger that keeps things in check, from transactions to proving your location and providing security and all that, then we don't have a network. We could not do this without this particular technology. And so for us, the hack is the blockchain, it's the cryptocurrency. And getting people interested in the cold start for us is really, I think instead of starting with the crypto world, we started in the wireless world. And so there's a huge fan base in Internet of Things, in IoT. And if they're in IoT, they kind of understand the struggle I've talked about, how hard it is.
Would you call yourself an IoT fan or a crypto fan?
Both?
Both.
Okay. And for us, it's really about, hey, all those IoT folks that have been struggling to get something up and get something working, this network could be the answer. I think it is the answer, but that's driven a lot of interest in early adopters in our hotspots and so forth.
What does it take to really start making money?
I knew you were going to ask that question.
Yeah, I can't help it.
It's very hard for me to say because in the world of cryptocurrencies, it's unknown. There's a lot of unknown regulation, uncertain sort of rules and guidelines, and so we're following whatever the rules the SEC shares. And one of the things I think is clear.
Oh, this is being recorded. Yeah.
Well, that's fine. One of the things that's clear for us as a company is we cannot be involved with a scheme that results in some promise of future earnings, and we're not promising that. What we are promising is an ecosystem where, as the network grows and becomes more pervasive, we're working our best to get users of that network to jump on board, essentially creating what Airbnb created in the hoteling industry, enabling your homes to become essentially a hotel room. We're doing that for networks. We want every home in Austin and beyond, in Texas and in the rest of the United States to be a network provider. And if you can do that, there will be users of that network that want to use your network instead of the Verizon, AT&T, and T-Mobile's network. So that's what we're focused on. And having blockchain and crypto as a way to get folks excited or to start the process of that is what it is. I know it's not the answer. I'm trying not to answer the answer, but that's the best I can do.
Yeah. So would be great to hear a little bit about some of the challenges you foresee having for Helium today and down the line.
Yeah, I think the first challenge, and I'll put it in perspective of folks that are here, entrepreneurs and such, is manufacturing. Manufacturing hardware is incredibly difficult. For us specifically, we decided to manufacture in the United States and keep everything in the US, partly because of the security and encryption that we're using. So every device has a hardware encrypted private key in the device, including the hotspot, and that's injected during the manufacturing process. And so we decided to keep that under our own supervision, and so the contract manufacturers that we use, they have to be in the United States. We're a small company. I don't want to have somebody out in China or Thailand sitting there doing this. It's painful. And so learning manufacturing and manufacturing at scale has been very hard. It's been humbling.
So you own your entire manufacturing and operation and supply chain?
So we outsource it, but outsource it here in the U.S. instead of overseas.
And is this proprietary hardware at all? Or?
This is all thank you for that. This is all off-the-shelf hardware. There are bits that we had to build and create, like the hardware encryption key and how it integrates with the 900 megahertz radio. That's us. But we're open sourcing the entire stack. So the hardware you see on the floor, all of that's open source. The firmware, the software, the blockchain, we're open sourcing all of it. If you go to our website, helium.com, you can get on the wait list to get the update when that launches. It should be between Halloween and Thanksgiving, when all the SDKs, APIs, the only thing stopping us from open sourcing right now is documentation. So that's the second thing that's really hard for us. First thing is manufacturing, getting manufacturing at scale to work right, delivering on time. Second thing is documenting your code and documenting your hardware.
Documentation is harder than
Holy cow. It's hard. Well, it's second hardest. Documentation is hard because you need tech writers, or you need someone that can write where you can read and understand. Yeah. Believe it or not, it's really hard to find. It's just, I don't know why. It's so hard. And so our engineers, after fighting all the fires and taking the support questions for the customers here in Austin, after that, they're writing, they're trying to write code, but then documenting it. And so it's just difficult.
What kind of feedback are you seeing from the 150 hotspot owners here in Austin? What are they communicating to you guys, and what are you learning?
Yeah, so what we've tried to do, because we're engaging with consumers, while the adoption of the hotspots are fairly technical folks, IoT folks, crypto folks, there's still nuances in the app. So we have a app that if you guys download, you'll see it's fairly consumer-esque. We're trying to make it as simple and as easy as possible so that our parents and our relatives know how to operate this thing. Yeah. And doing that, in that process, there's a lot of workflow, there's a lot of user experience hiccups here and there that we've actually got really good feedback from our users on. So that's what we've been iterating on.
Am I doing okay on time? Is Damon still here? Oh, hi. Okay.
Great. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna. one or two more questions that we can move into audience
Sure.
Q&A. So if someone is interested
Yeah.
in building on the Helium network
Right.
or in purchasing a hotspot, and I heard that you guys were sold out at one point.
Yep.
What are we all supposed to do?
Yeah, so if you're interested in developing on our platform, you want the developer kit, the Featherwing, access to the SDK, APIs, please come to helium.com, get yourself on that wait list, and we'll send you info ASAP. If you want to buy a Helium hotspot, it's retailing at $495 online, but because you're here, I'm going to give you a special code that's only available for you here. It's CF100 for $100 off. It's only good until this Austin startup week ends. I don't know what
Friday?
I don't know when it
Thursday?
ends. But if you're sitting here now, you've got the code. It's capital C, capital F for Capital Factory, CF100, and you get $100 off.
Right.
We're not this is not public. I'm not going to go on social media and share this. It's just because you're willing to sit here and listen to me, talk.
Awesome. Well, we appreciate that.
Helium.com. Just go check it out. Yeah.
All right. Anything else you want to share with the audience before we turn it over to them?
No, look, guys, thanks for your support. This is a leap of faith, right? This is audacious. It's crazy, but we think we can do it. We've built a network in the city of Austin that has coverage beyond what the city needs in a matter of like weeks, and if you thought about sort of the progress of 5G and what telcos are trying to do, I have no idea where 5G is, except for my AT&T phone says I have 5GE, which is a lie, and I hate that. Like, why do they lie like that? But they do. And so there is no 5G, folks, and there is no 5G because it's built by a central entity, and they have to negotiate with the city, the county, get on towers. That takes years. It takes a lot of money. But we can build a network faster than anyone. I think we can't do it without all the people here, so thank you.
Love that. Okay. Anyone have any questions?
Is there a concern that some users' application might start flooding the network and causing exorbitantly high bandwidth costs to the hotspot?
Question is about users using this network. Could they drive too much data onto the network, creating excess usage on your bandwidth? So the answer is no. That shouldn't happen. And the reason why, again, is the packet sizes are in bursts, and the bursts are roughly, we're talking 24 bytes to 20 kilobytes. So that isn't a whole lot. Now, the hotspot, as far as what we've been able to test in the lab, is each hotspot can handle around 300,000 bursts concurrently of small bytes, right? So that does add up. But hopefully that's not a problem in the future. Like, imagine if we had 300 hotspots in the city here, that kind of diffuses the problem, maybe. But I don't know. At the end of the day, it shouldn't be a problem, but.
But then if you're open sourcing your sensors,
Yes.
couldn't I then build a sensor that sends more frequent bursts?
You can. Yeah. So if we're open sourcing a sensor, but you have to pay for it, right? So yeah, if you're we're open sourcing sensors, so you could build sensors that use the maximum amount of bandwidth possible, and you're bursting every nanosecond. You could attempt to do that. There's nothing to stop you, except every time you're going to use the network, you have to pay a data credit. So there's a whole idea of data credits, kind of like AWS. When you use AWS, you have to buy AWS credits or Azure credits. Helium has something called a data credit to get access onto the network. It's just a fraction of, we're talking fractions of pennies. Who is it? What's the limiting factor of connecting node to node? Between hotspot to hotspot? I don't know the answer to that. There's a couple things. So the radio on the hotspot is operating 900 megahertz. It listens and it transmits. The transmitting factor is fairly far. It can get really far. Whether it chooses to transmit or not is something we're tuning on the blockchain. So today, a hotspot can talk to another hotspot of up to about 1.5 miles. Theoretically, that can go as far as 18 miles. There's no reason why it wouldn't. But from a consensus perspective on the blockchain side, we're fencing that for now to better understand the way consensus works based on physical distance. So that those are some limiting factors for you. But bandwidth-wise, it's the same as what a tracker sensor would be. Yeah, so the question is are there other use cases like vehicle to infrastructure? You know, there hasn't yet, but I'm going to Dallas and I'm meeting with a big car manufacturer to go talk about that in Dallas, to talk about how that would work, car to infrastructure. We've done some tests with a county in California called County of San Mateo. They're the county where San Francisco International Airport is located. And one of the things that we've tested with them is car to meter, street meter parking. I guess it's free here, but in California we have to pay for street parking. Sucks. And the car to meter is something that we've tested before. Basically having a helium sensor be able to initiate payment to the meter without human interaction. Yep.
We're all looking for that alternative connection, and if you think about what you're building, if I put a hotspot and I'm near like the park and more people use my hotspot, am I going to get more credits? And will eventually we'll be able to monetize that in cash? First question. Second one, do you see you guys going to TV Whitespace or CBRS or AX as another communication platform?
So I'll answer the second one first. The second part of the question was, do we see ourselves going to TV spectrums and other spectrums? The answer is maybe. The interesting thing about our incentive model, the blockchain, is that we can detach it from 900. It doesn't have to be only for IoT. We're just using it to prove a point here that we can build networks quickly for IoT devices, which is white space. It's needed. But you can apply this to 5G. There's 5G open spectrum where you can imagine we can create 5G devices for every home, and you can offer 5G connectivity independent of the cell carriers. So that's sort of probably on the roadmap for us. To answer your first question, which is if you're near a park, lots of devices are using your hotspot, do you earn more tokens for that? I have to look back at our token economics. I believe it's possible because you'll do more work in that process, and so you'll get more credits at the end of the month, quote unquote, based on the pool per month. So you should earn more. Other questions? Yes.
As a developer, would I have to worry about regulatory concerns if I build something?
How so? No. So the question is as a developer, do you have to worry about regulation on the spectrum we're using? So we're using 900 megahertz, which is ISM. It's unregulated spectrum. So it's open. So there's no regulations. Yeah. How do we find manufacturers? So we're based in San Francisco, California, and there's quite a few contract manufacturers that are willing to do low volumes, meaning not 1 million units. It's just very expensive, very costly. Like our price point, we don't make any money. We're losing money.
That's why they raised a lot of money.
Yeah, we don't make money on this. And it's expensive because we're not making it overseas, unfortunately. But we're just going to have to pay the price for that. The other thought for us is once we open source this tech, we've been talking to the guys at Linksys and Netgear and all they can go build this for fractions of what we're doing, and that's what we want. At the end of the day, if they take this and they build it, we'll be super happy. That's the whole point, is proliferating a network and making it grow as fast as possible. So you have to open source. There's a question in the back, or any other questions? Yep.
So if I get rid of my Wi-Fi or my router at home, or can you handle my streaming video and all that?
So the question is, should you get rid of your Wi-Fi at home? The answer is no. we're not operating off of, this is not for streaming, it's for small bytes of data. So think temperature sensors and GPS coordinates. So it's tiny bits of data. So it's not meant to replace your vehicle for Netflix. So I wouldn't do that if I were you. Yeah, so it'd be add-on. The range of the device to the hotspot, in a city like this with tons of buildings around, probably 1.5 miles, based on what I've tested. Depends. If you get higher up in the building and top, let's say you're on the roof, you can get like 18 miles. Question? So the question, if you can't hear, is about power on the hotspot, leveraging satellite GPS versus time delay of arrival on the RF side. And so the power with time delay of arrival and GPS on the hotspot is roughly 6 watts continuously. So it's the power of an LED light bulb, essentially. That does a lot for us. Today, our sensors and trackers, if you want to use it for tracking and tracing, does still require GPS as a primary way to find location. We don't have enough density of hotspots to do the TDOA, the time delay of arrival on RF. We should soon. And the other thing we're going to refine on for the sensor itself is have Wi-Fi sniffing capability. So if you're indoors or you have other applications like you want to do some greenhouse farming and such, you could use Wi-Fi sniffing and sniff whatever is available near you, just to be smarter about connectivity in general.
Great. Well, thanks everyone. I think we have a developer happy hour at 4:30. So stick around for some beverages that Damon is supplying for us. Never mind. CU29 bar, 4:30. It's right across the street, that way. All right.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you. That was fun.
Thank you, Kelsey.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Glad all I had to do was ask you questions. So.